They say the dead speak only in whispers, but that is not true. Not when the wind shifts over the Ashford estate, not when the shadows move across the cracked iron gates that have not opened willingly since 1814, and not when you stand alone beneath the broken eaves of that godless house and feel the presence of something older than language, something that never needed words to command. Obedience, something that fed on silence for centuries and still hungers for more. And that is where it begins. Not with a name, not with a man, but with a question that no one in the county dares to ask aloud anymore. Why did the Ashford family survive when so many others vanished from the ledgers of time? Because to survive is not always to endure sometimes, it is to devour. And what the Ashfords built, they did not build with timber or sweat or coin, but with sacrifice deliberate and generational, beginning long before the estate was raised above. The red soil of Marion's Hollow, long before the first child screamed behind the walls that would never echo outward, again, long before their name was spoken with reverence and dread in the same breath, because the Ashfords did not rise from humble beginnings. They were never humble. They emerged already watching, already listening, already prepared to erase anyone who stood in the path of their inheritance. And if you trace their bloodline far enough back past the colonial papers and into the ash-scorched church records of Sussex, you will not find their name. You will find only the symbol carved beneath the priest's final sermon, a symbol that matches the brass seal beneath the Ashford dining room floor, the one no one has opened in over 200 years, because those who tried to unseal lost more than their hands. The origin of the Ashford legacy is not found in birth or land or deed. It is found in removal, the calculated removal of history, subtraction of others, so that only one line remained, only one story could be told, and that story is a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie stitched into sermons and genealogies, until even the archivists believed it, and the church knelt to it, and the town bled for it, and no one noticed how the Ashfords never buried their own, how no tombstones bear their names, how the family crypt was sealed before the War of 1812, and never reopened, not even when the patriarch Jonathan Ashford was declared missing, not even when his wife went blind and dumb, and sat weeping in the orchard for 7 winters repeating a name. That does not appear in any Bible. The estate itself is a map if you know how to read it. The rooms are not arranged to comfort or entertain. They are arranged to contain. There are no windows in the center corridor because light was not permitted to touch certain rooms, and the walls are thick enough to muffle a scream, but not the sound of the bell that rang 3 times every night at precisely 2:06, a bell that had no visible source and no apparent purpose other than to mark the hour when the Ashfords were said to perform the reading of the inheritance, not of land, not of property, but of memory, that was passed down not through books, but through ritual, through bleeding, through silence, and every child of that line was brought into the circle at the age of 13 and taught not to ask where the blood came from. What you must understand is that the Ashfords did not worship anything. They did not kneel to gods. They did not summon spirits. They were the ritual. They embodied the sacrament. Their mere continuation was the spell, and to maintain that continuity, they erased all deviation. There is evidence if you look in the cracks of the Ashford ledger's names scratched out with blades, not ink whole pages removed and burned children who appeared in baptism records, but not in the family census and midwives who vanished after attending births, and only one doctor permitted on the grounds for nearly 70 years, a man whose own diary ends with a single line, "They are not what they claim," and then nothing, the ink cuts off mid-sentence, the page torn violently away, and his name never appeared in the town registry again. What survives are whispers of the original pact, and this is where the story sharpens, where it becomes less about power and more about submission, because power in the Ashford legacy was never about dominion over others. It was about obedience to a force so old, so intimate, that it could only be felt in the marrow of the spine, and to betray it was to vanish and never be mentioned again. And so the line remained unbroken, even as marriages crumbled and children screamed and the fields turned. Barren the line remained because it was never allowed to break. It was reinforced by blood, by arrangement, by the selection of partners. Not for love or alliance, but for compatibility, the kind of compatibility that has nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with breeding, with control, with containment. You can see it in the portraits that hang crooked in the West Wing, every face, the same elongated jaw, deep-set eyes, right-handed signatures. Every subject drawn slightly off-center, as if something stood beside them, something not captured by paint. But always presents something the family allowed to remain, even as they erased everything else, and behind those portraits are walls, not closets, not rooms, just walls. And within those walls are marks carved in desperation by hands that no longer exist, and the phrase help me spelled not in English, but in a dialect only the oldest. Ashford text describes a dialect predating written language. No one speaks of where the first Ashford came from, because no one knows the name appears suddenly in land. Transfers in 1761 attached to the deed of a property. No one remembers building the land. Itself was not for sale. It was granted without cause by a judge who died the following winter, and whose family refused to claim his estate. A man who left behind a single surviving letter in which he describes the petitioner. Jonathan Ashford as a man whose eyes did not move when he blinked, and whose voice seemed to echo even when speaking alone. And from that moment forward, the Ashfords were established, not earned, not integrated, simply present. And no one questioned it, because the crops grew, and the money flowed, and the town grew quiet. But the quiet was never peace. It was suppression. It was fear. It was a silence enforced not by threat but by implication, because when a child disappeared, people simply prayed harder, and when a midwife vanished, her house was auctioned, and no one asked who signed the deed. And when the bell rang at 2:06, they covered their ears and wept and told themselves they were lucky to live near such a blessed family. And no one spoke of the nights when firelight could be seen beneath the orchard, or the scent of burning hair drifted on the wind, or the animals screamed for no reason, because to speak was to attract attention, and attention was never something you wanted from the Ashfords. The origin, then, is not a moment. It is a method, a calculated, sustained method of erasure, of concealment, of ritualized survival, passed down not through speech, but through blood, through gesture, through the way a father holds a son's hand just a little too tight during communion, or the way the family leaves the pew 5 minutes before the sermon ends, or the way the estate gates open for no one, not even the sheriff, and close on their own with a sound like grinding teeth. It is said that one Ashford girl once tried to run in 1823. She made it as far as the tree line before her mouth sealed shut, and she clawed her own face off, trying to scream, and was buried behind the estate wall in a grave that grows nothing not, even moss, and her name was never entered into the book, and her mother was found blind 3 days later, whispering she touched it, she touched it, she touched it, and then silence. What the Ashfords inherited was not property. It was preservation of a pattern, a sacred repetition that required blood and secrecy and a refusal to forget, even as the world changed around them, and as railways came and telegraphs sang in wars were fought. No Ashford ever left the estate for more than 3 days, and no visitor ever returned with the same eyes, and those who married into the line were never seen in town again, not even for funerals, and their children bore the Ashford mark, a birthmark in the shape of a ring of teeth at the base of the spine, visible only under moonlight. This is not family. This is a system, a containment protocol, wearing the mask of nobility, and the origin is not the beginning of a life. It is the suppression of all others. It is the decision that one name, one blood, one ritual would be permitted to exist, and nothing else would be remembered. And that is why no records survive beyond the young Ashford version of events, because all other versions were consumed literally in some cases, and the archivists who resisted were found with their eyes turned to glass and their tongues split as if by boiling wire. And now the house sits as it always has, alive with memory, not nostalgia, but memory, the kind that does not fade, the kind that echoes, the kind that punishes you for leaving and rewards you for remaining. And if you listen closely late at night, when the fog rolls over the hills and the bell tolls again, you will hear the house breathing slowly, deeply, waiting not for a visitor, but for a return. Because the Ashford line is not finished, it never ends. It only waits and watches and breathes and remembers. Because that is the true origin of the Ashford legacy. It remembers what you tried to forget. And it never forgets you. Never. Then let us continue and descend deeper into the hollow space where names are carved into silence. And truth is buried beneath the weight of a legacy no man was ever meant to touch, because what came after the origin of thee. Ashford legacy was not growth, not prosperity, not the gentle passage of time, but something else, something colder, something sharper, that began with a single name, scratched from the church registry in 1819, and a child who vanished not in the dark of night, but at noon under the clearest sky the county had seen in a decade, a disappearance that nobody investigated, not because they could not, but because they would not. And you must understand this distinction before anything else can make sense, because silence is not always fear. Sometimes it is protection, and sometimes it is complicity. Her name was Clara Ashford, the youngest daughter of Edmund and Seraphina, born with a birthmark shaped like a closed eye at the base of her neck, a child who spoke in a voice far too old for her body, and who drew shapes in the dirt that no one recognized until decades later, when a surveyor uncovered a map beneath the estate floor etched into a lead plate showing a version of the land that did not match any known topography, a map not of earth, but of something beneath it. And Clara was last seen walking into the orchard barefoot, holding a length of crimson thread and humming a tune that made the dogs howl until they broke their own teeth against the gate, and the servants turned their backs and whispered it was time again, just like before, and the house locked itself from the inside for 3 days. The official story was illness. The family physician declared it a fever of the brain. Despite no body being recovered, no grave dug, no rites performed, and no priest summoned, and the town accepted this without question, not because they believed it, but because belief had long been traded for survival. And to ask where Clara had gone was to summon the attention of the estate, and no one wanted that, not after what happened to Reverend Ellery, who asked too many questions and was found suspended upside down in his own well, with his hands turned backwards at the wrists and his tongue wrapped around a communion wafer etched with a symbol last seen on a Roman tablet sealed beneath the Vatican archives. But the question remained even unspoken. How does a child vanish under full sun on land, watched by 27 servants and surrounded by 12-foot walls? And why was the only thing left behind a ring of salt in the shape of a spiral around her bedroom mirror, a mirror that has since been removed from the estate entirely and locked in a museum basement in Boston under the condition that it never be cleaned, never be displayed, and never be exposed to moonlight, because during the war, a curator accidentally uncovered it during an air raid and began speaking in a tongue no one could translate until his own throat split open and he drowned in silence. And still the disappearance of Clara was not investigated, because to investigate is to assume the presence of evidence, and what the Ashfords had mastered by that time was the removal of evidence not by destruction, but by prevention. There were no prints, no footsteps, no witnesses, only the humming which some claimed to still hear in the orchard at dusk even now. And when a group of schoolchildren once dared each other to sneak onto the grounds in 1953, only one returned, and he was never able to close his eyes again, not even with surgical aid. And when he died, they found fragments of bone in his stomach that matched no known species. And his last words were, "She's still humming. I can't make it stop. I can't make it stop. I can't." The Ashfords never denied Clara's existence, but they never acknowledged it either. Her portraits were painted over her name, removed from family Bibles her room, sealed with bricks and prayers, and even the staff were rotated every 3 years. To prevent the accumulation of memory, because the longer one stayed, the more they remembered, and the more they remembered, the more. They began to question what they saw at night beneath the floorboards, or behind the mirrors, or in the spaces between. The walls that seemed to shift when no one was looking, and yet the bell still rang, and the thread still reappeared crimson and unbroken, tied to the base of the oldest tree in the orchard, a tree that bleeds when cut and screams when burned, as one groundskeeper discovered before his mouth filled with ash, and he collapsed with his eyes turned completely black. It is not that the disappearance of Clara was ignored. It is that it was absorbed. The estate swallowed it and incorporated it into its ritual as it had done with so many others, and the silence that followed was not emptiness, but saturation saturated. With memory, with compulsion, with a thick, heavy weight that sits in the bones of anyone who steps within 100 yards of the estate wall, and if you have ever felt the air grow colder near a place you cannot name, if you have ever heard a child's laughter where no child should be, if you have ever woken with blood in your mouth and a thread wrapped around your wrist, then you too have brushed against the perimeter of the Ashford silence. What they were protecting, what they were containing, was not a secret, but a process, a calibration of blood and ritual and time that required periodic offerings, not always sacrifices, not always intentional, but necessary. Clara was not the first, nor the last, and those who disappeared from the estate did so, not randomly, but rhythmically, always 13 years, apart, always in the same month, always at the same angle of sunlight, and always preceded by the scent of honeysuckle, which does not grow on the property, and which the Ashfords are deathly allergic to, or so they claim, though no medical record confirms it. What few know is that during the brief period when the estate was partially open to the Red Cross, during the influenza wave of 1918, 3 nurses entered the West Wing and only one returned, and she spoke of a door that did not lead to another room but to a slope, a downward slope that grew colder the farther she walked, until she saw a shape at the bottom, not human, not animal, not even alive in any conventional sense, but present, absolutely present, in a way that made her own name begin to fade from her memory, and when she turned to run, she found the slope had disappeared and the door had moved and her colleagues were gone, and when she finally escaped, she was blind in one eye and every hair on her body had turned white, and the Ashfords thanked her for her service and paid for her relocation to Norway, where she was found dead 10 years later, having carved the name Clara into the ice of her cottage over and over and over until her hands were raw and frozen into claws. So the disappearance was not simply a loss. It was a signal, a realignment of the house and the rituals and the family line, and those who understand such things believe that Clara was not taken, but chosen, that the spiral of salt was not left in panic, but in invitation, and that she walked into the orchard not to flee, but to join. And if that sounds impossible, ask yourself this: why was her mother seen speaking to the empty corner of her bedroom every night for the rest of her life? And why did the house servants claim to hear the sound of small footsteps 2 days before every death in the family? And why did every mirror in the estate crack simultaneously on the day Seraphina Ashford died, with her mouth sewn shut with crimson thread and her hands folded in the shape of the spiral? The deeper truth is that the Ashfords do not mourn, because mourning implies separation, and for them there is no separation, only proximity, only nearness or distance. And when someone disappears, they do not leave, they transition, and the estate adjusts. The walls shift, the bells ring, a silence resets, and the line continues. because the ritual requires balance, and Clara's absence was not an absence at all. It was a substitution, a recalibration, and her presence persists in ways that are not physical, not visible, but absolutely undeniable. And if you stand in the orchard at the right moment and press your ear to the ground, you will hear her humming, and if you follow it, you will not return. This is why no investigation was ever made, because to investigate is to uncover, and to uncover is to disrupt, and to disrupt is to invite. Consequences that cannot be named, only endured. And so the town endures, the land endures, the estate endures. And the Ashford name remains untouched by law, by time, by decay, because what they preserve is not life. It is pattern. What they protect is not history, it is continuity. And what they fear is not exposure, but interruption, because the humming must never stop. The ritual must never break. The bloodline must never fracture. So Clara's disappearance was not the tragedy it appeared to be. It was something far older, far more deliberate, a return to a cycle. The family had never fully escaped and never intended to. And if you feel the air change and the silence deepen, and the thread brush against your skin, you are already within reach of the pattern, and once it notices you, it never lets go. Then let the silence collapse further, and let the illusions of heritage and inheritance fall like rotted cloth, because what lies beyond disappearance is not emptiness, but intention, not tragedy, but preparation. And if you believe the Ashford family merely hid behind their wealth or buried their sins in cellars, then you have not yet understood the nature of their legacy, because this was never about secrecy. It was always about structure, about ritual, about a system designed not to be seen, but to be followed blindly, instinctively, bloodline to bloodline, with no deviation, and no deviation was ever tolerated, not even once. And that is where the horror sharpens into clarity, because the rituals were not superstition, they were machinery, and the Ashfords were not practicing, they were maintaining something older than reason and deeper than death. The bloodlines mattered because the blood itself was never metaphorical. It was literal, it was functional, it was sacred, not in the sense of worship, but in the sense of requirement, the way oil is sacred to the engine or bone is sacred to the skeleton. And if the line failed to replicate itself precisely, the mechanism failed, and when the mechanism failed, the house shifted, and when the house shifted, people disappeared, not by violence, not by force, but by subtraction, by removal from memory, and from space itself. And that is what happened in 1841, when a child was born without the mark, without the spiral, without the compatibility, and the entire east wing of the estate collapsed inward overnight and was never rebuilt, and the child's name was never recorded, and no one spoke of it again, not even the parents, who were found with their jaws torn open and their skulls split in perfect symmetrical halves. The rituals required precision, and they required flesh, and they required silence, and that is why the Ashfords built their chapel underground, not for secrecy, but for temperature, for resonance, because sound carries differently beneath stone, and the spiral carved into the chapel floor was not decoration, it was alignment, it was calibration, and those who were brought there were not taught. They were tuned like instruments until their thoughts matched the tone of the house, and their blood sang in rhythm with the bell that rings not from the belfry, but from beneath the orchard, where the soil is too red and too soft, and where nothing ever grows except the tree that bleeds when cut, and beneath that tree is not a root system, but a gate. Every Ashford child was brought to the chapel on their 13th birthday blindfolded and barefoot and silent. They were not spoken to, they were not comforted, they were observed, and they were marked not with ink, but with a blade carved into the left side of the chest above the heart, a line followed by a circle, followed by a downward curve, the mark of acceptance or rejection, depending on how the blood moved. And if the blood did not move in the right direction, the child did not leave. The chapel, and no one asked where they had gone, and the bell rang once, and the estate adjusted, and the house forgot the room they once occupied, and the family continued, because it must continue. It cannot stop. It cannot break. The rituals were recorded not on paper, but in flesh. Every Ashford bore a mark, and every mark was a sentence, and when arranged correctly, the marks could be read like scripture. And it is said that the oldest Ashford, the one who first arrived in Marion's Hollow, bore no fewer than 97 marks, each one placed by a different hand over the course of 50 years, and that his final breath carried a name not of a person, but of a presence, something that had no form and no need for one. Something that the rituals were designed to contain or communicate with, or perhaps even replicate. And if that sounds insane, then you have not stood in the center of the spiral beneath the chapel with your eyes closed and your mouth open and your breath stolen from you by something that tastes like memory and sounds like teeth clicking in time with your heartbeat. The bloodlines were not just preserved, they were engineered, arranged like equations, with careful pairings and enforced unions and deliberate removals of those whose lineage could not be verified. And that is why the Ashfords kept such extensive records, not for pride, but for accuracy, because a single drop of incompatible blood could undo the work of centuries. And when it did, the consequences were not symbolic. They were immediate and physical and irreversible, like the winter of 1876, when a child was conceived by a woman from outside the line, and for 9 months the estate suffered structural instability. Rooms rearranged themselves, corridors vanished, entire wings locked from the inside, and when the child was born, it did not cry. It did not breathe, but it blinked, and its eyes were entirely black, and the doctor who delivered it walked into the woods the following morning and was never seen again, and the child was placed in the chapel, and the spiral sealed behind stone. This was not cruelty. This was necessity, because the rituals were not optional. They were not decorative. They were not acts of belief. They were requirements, survival mechanisms, obedience protocols, established long before the Ashfords arrived in Virginia and passed down through gesture and mark and arrangement, and the house itself participated in the ritual. The house was not passive. It was not merely a setting. It was alive, or perhaps occupied, and it responded to failure with reconfiguration, with correction, and those who resisted the correction were absorbed or erased, depending on the severity of the deviation, and their memories did not persist, not even in dreams, not even in trace emotions, only in the sound of a voice you almost recognize in the dark, or the shape of a shadow that does not belong to anyone in the room. And still the rituals continued every 13 years, a renewal, a correction, a cycle aligned with lunar and solar positions, with astronomical coordinates, not published in any almanac, and those chosen were not selected at random. They were born, already chosen, born with the mark, born with the voice that echoes even when silent, and when the time came. They did not resist. They entered the chapel of their own will, guided by the humming that begins 7 nights before the solstice and ends only when the spiral is complete, and the blood has touched the center stone, and the bell has rung, and the name has been spoken, and the house has reset. There were those who tried to intervene, scholars, occultists, priests, even family members, and all of them failed, not because they were stopped, but because they forgot. They lost the thread, they lost their purpose, they lost themselves, and when they returned, they were no longer aligned with the world. Their clocks ran backward, their hearts beat too. Slowly their reflections blinked before they did, and they could not remember what they had seen, only that it had seen them first, and if asked, they would say only one thing over and over and over again: the spiral opens inward. And now the bloodlines are thinner, the rituals more fragile, the estate quieter, and the humming more frequent, and some believe the cycle is nearing its conclusion, or its escalation, or its transformation, and the last true heir of the Ashford line has already been marked, already chosen, already humming in her sleep, and the spiral is nearly complete, and when it is. When the final drop of blood touches the stone, and the bell rings for the last time, the house will not merely shift, it will open. And what has been watching through the walls, and listening through the mirrors, and breathing beneath the orchard will no longer be content to remember it will emerge. And that is why the Ashfords maintain the bloodlines, not for vanity, not for legacy, but for alignment, because the body is the temple, and the temple must be pure, and the spiral must be unbroken, and the bell must ring, and the blood must flow, and the house must breathe, and when the breathing stops, so does everything else. Then let it continue, and let this final veil be lifted not with reverence, not with restraint, but with the raw and necessary violence of truth, because behind the Ashford estate walls there is no opulence, no sanctuary, no portrait of family virtue. Only layers of containment constructed not to keep outsiders away, but to keep something inside, something that moves without, sound and waits without hunger, something that does not dream, does not die, and does not forget. And the estate itself is not a house, not in the traditional sense. It is a prison, but not for men. It is a containment site for memory, for pattern, for something older than blood that wears the name Ashford like a mask, and behind those walls is where the mask begins to slip. To enter the estate is to descend not through space, but through states. The first floor greets you with the illusion of nobility. Grand staircases, muted oil portraits, faint traces of rosewood and lace. But that is not real. It is a facade grafted over something much older, and if you stay too long, the wallpaper begins to peel, and the air thickens, and the stairs no longer lead where they should, and every door opens into a room you have never seen before, and never will again. And the scent of something sweet and rotting begins to follow you not from any visible source, but from the walls themselves, because the walls remember, and the deeper you go, the more they remember you. Behind the walls are the rooms that were not mapped rooms, that do not exist on any blueprint or architectural record, rooms with no windows, no doors, no furniture, only space and silence and cold. And in these rooms the rituals were refined, repeated, reversed, recorded, and erased. And in one of these rooms the walls are covered in teeth, human and animal, and something else entirely, and no one has ever explained how they are embedded so perfectly into the plaster, as if grown from within. And then me. Teeth hum at night, and if you press your ear to them, you will hear a voice. You recognize whispering something you have never heard before in a language you should not understand. There are tunnels too older than the foundation, carved in spirals and loops, some sealed with bone and ash, and others lined with mirrors that do not reflect your body, but your absence, as if something has already taken your place and is now looking back. And these tunnels are never dry. They drip with condensation that burns the skin and leaves no mark. And those who have entered these passages without permission have never been the same, not in gait, not in thought, not in language. And some come back, speaking in a voice not their own, speaking of a library, with no books and a door that opens inwards forever, and a hand that writes names onto your soul instead of paper. Behind the main dining room is a wall that should not exist, built too thick with no seam, and yet, if you place your hand upon it and hold your breath, you will feel it pulse faintly, slowly in rhythm with something beneath the floor, something too large to name and too familiar to dismiss. And that is where the stone is hidden, the central stone, the one Clara's blood touched, the one that is neither man-made nor naturally formed, the one that hums when the spiral is complete, and grows warm when a child is born, and splits the air when the rituals are missed, and leaves cracks in the minds of those who try to sketch its shape, because it has no shape, only a presence, a pressure, a density of memory so old it forgets itself. And deeper still, beyond the third sublevel, in a chamber not dug but revealed like an ulcer, is the room with no sound, no echo, no breath, where the Ashfords go when the blood is wrong and the time is near and the house is shifting, And there in that room are the names, every name of every. Ashford etched not on the wall, but in the air like vapor, like breath held too long, and released all at once, and each name floats silently until spoken, and once spoken it is erased from every memory except the houses. And that is how they remember, that is how they select, and that is how they erase. There is a hallway too narrow to walk, lined with bells, tied with crimson thread, and each bell rings. For a soul lost, not dead, just misplaced, and the thread runs down the hallway and disappears into a crack beneath the floorboards that no one has ever been able to follow. And when the bells ring, they do not make sound. They make memory. They make regret. They make a voice in your mind that tells you to lie down and forget your name, and forget your body, and wait for the spiral to find you. And above it all in the attic, sealed from within with wax and iron, lies the mirror room not made of glass, but of something else, something older, something alive. And in that room every Ashford must stand on their 13th birthday and be shown not their reflection, but their continuity. They see what came before and what will come after, and they do not scream, they do not run, they do not question, because by the time they enter that room, they are no longer children, they are no longer individuals, they are extensions of the mechanism, and their purpose has been carved into the bone behind their eyes, and when they leave the mirror room, they are complete. What hides behind the Ashford estate walls is not simply darkness, it is not simply history, it is not even simply evil, it is continuity, it is a perfect, unbroken rhythm of memory, and selection and erasure, maintained through silence and ritual and blood, and the walls hold that rhythm like lungs hold breath, and they release it only when it is safe, when the line is strong and the spiral is sealed, and until then they wait. They pulse, they remember. And that is why no outsider has ever mapped the house, not because they failed, but because the house is not fixed. It is not architectural, it is conditional. It changes based on the blood. It recognizes the intention. It detects the presence of memory. And if you are not meant to see a room, you never will. And if you are meant to see a truth, you cannot escape it. And those who have tried to draw the floor plan end up drawing something else, something circular, something organic, something alive. Behind the walls are the echoes of every ritual, every scream, every correction, every sacrifice, and they are not silent. They are not ghosts. They are recordings played back by the house at precise intervals, and those who hear them feel them beneath the skin like a second heartbeat, and when the timing is right, the bell rings and the room locks and the spiral completes and the next correction begins. And if you think you can avoid it, if you think distance is protection, then you do not understand how memory works, because the Ashfords did not bind their rituals to the house. They bound them to the blood, and the blood travels, and so the pattern travels, and if you have touched it, even once it has already touched you, and the humming you hear is not from the house, it is from your own veins, singing in resonance, waiting for the bell, waiting for the thread, waiting for the name. Because behind the Ashford estate walls is not a secret, it is a system, and you were never meant to understand it, only to obey it, or be forgotten by it. And if you find yourself standing before the gate, and the house looks smaller than it should, and the air smells sweet, and the thread touches your wrist, do not run, do not speak, do not breathe, because the spiral is opening again, and it remembers you, and it is time. Did you ever wonder why no one ever tore down the Ashford estate after the final collapse of the bloodline? Why no one purchased it? No government seized it. No historical society stepped in to preserve what should have been a monument to New England aristocracy. Because in the end, it was never a home, never a manor, never a legacy of art or architecture or family pride. It was always a container, a structure designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep something far older in. And as you stand before its rotting iron gates, you can feel it even now. The way the ground does not welcome your weight, the way the trees do not sway with the wind, but remain rigid. fixed in their ancient poses, as if they were watching, as if they remembered, because they do, because the land was marked, because the foundation was never laid with stone alone, but with packed in blood and silence. And as you walk up the cracked path toward the once glorious arch that bears no name, only the outline where the family crest was carved and later scraped away by trembling hands, you begin to feel it too, that thinning of the veil, that tightening in the lungs, that whispering pressure behind the eyes, that presence that asks no questions and waits for no answers. Because by stepping onto this ground, you are already part of it. They say the Ashford family line ended in 1923. They say the last heir died childless and alone, found face down in the reflecting pool behind the greenhouse, the one with no water left. Just ash and insects and small white bones that no one could identify. They say the death was natural, a heart failure, a seizure, a moment of madness. But what they do not say is what was written in the margin of the coroner's report in handwriting, too fine for a man's hand and too violent in its slant to be faked. It read simply, "It has returned," and then below that one word over and over again. Like father, like father, like father, like father, until the ink tore through the paper, and the report was sealed and removed from public records, and the investigator who filed it was reassigned to a post in Alaska, where he died of frostbite with his boots still on, facing a frozen lake that had no name, whispering one word over and over until his throat dried up and cracked like burnt paper. Ashford. Ashford. You think this is dramatic exaggeration, myth-making, the kind of local legend that builds around old families and old estates and secretive legacies. But you are wrong, because what the public never knew, what the news never reported, was that the house had been empty for over a decade before the last Ashford was declared dead, that the lights still turned on in rooms no one entered, that the fire still crackled in the hearth, even though no wood had been delivered since 1911, that once a month on the 13th night, a figure in a black coat and no face was seen by passing train conductors standing at the upper balcony, not moving, not blinking, not turning, just watching the trees until the train had gone. And when they filed reports, they were told to forget it, to erase it, to understand it as light tricks or hallucinations from too little sleep. But they knew what they saw, and they stopped looking toward the estate. They began pulling the window curtains shut every time they passed the Ashford property, and said nothing until they retired or died or vanished into the cold white woods. What you must understand now is that the Ashford family did not die out by natural decay. They did not collapse from scandal or bad fortune or simple generational weakness. No, the Ashfords were eaten, consumed from the inside out by something they had carried with them since the beginning, since the founding of the estate, since before America was a country, before the colony had roads, before the land was mapped, when they were still newcomers and settlers and thieves. And it began, as it always does, with one man who wanted more than he was owed, Thomas Ashford the elder, the patriarch, the supposed pioneer, a man who stood before the endless forest and decided it could be made to kneel, who found a hill of black stone where nothing grew, and said, "This is mine," and drove his cane into the ground and smiled when the wind stopped blowing, who built the first version of the estate with walls so thick you could scream inside and no one would hear, not even God. There is a document still held in the sealed archives of a local county office, marked under non-catalogued religious holdings, written in ink that has turned dark red with time, signed with the initials TIA and a symbol that no language claims. And the title is not in English, not in Latin, but something older, twisting script that hurts to look at for too long. And it is a contract, not with the state, not with any church, but with something else, something whose name was never written, only implied in silence, something that promised in return for obedience and ritual and generational offering. The Ashford line would never fall. Their wealth would never dry. Their blood would remain pure and unbroken. But as with all such agreements, there was a clause, there was a cost. And that cost was not gold or land or titles. It was attention. Constant and unyielding attention, the kind that cannot look away, the kind that sees through skin and into the root of the soul, the kind that makes you feel like a stranger in your own body. And the moment the line broke that attention, turned hostile. The truth is, the Ashfords never built anything. They only fed something. They only appeased it. They kept it quiet, distracted, buried, and for 200 years it was enough. They poured in blood, in fear, in names never spoken aloud, in the sound of footsteps pacing in rooms with no doors, in the laughter of children who never aged, in the crying of women who never bled, in the silence of men who burned their journals before they hanged themselves in the orchard. And they thought this would be enough. They thought this would last forever. But it didn't, because in 1899, the wrong child was born. Her name was Eliza, but that was not her real name. That was the name they gave her to pass in society, to appear in ledgers and invites and family portraits. But within the estate walls, she was never called that. She was called Daughter of the Fifth Gate. She was kept apart, fed differently, taught not to speak, but to listen. And they said she was the next vessel, the perfect vessel, the one who would make the pact permanent, who would carry it in flesh rather than stone or paper. But she was not perfect. She was awake. She asked questions. She resisted. And in the winter of her 17th year she ran, not away from the estate, but into it, deeper than anyone had ever gone, down into the catacombs that even the patriarchs feared. And what she found there broke her mind in a way no one could repair. Because she saw it, not its face, it has no face, but its pattern, its rhythm, the way it breathes, not in air, but in time, the way it rearranges the walls when no one is watching, the way it waits, always waits. And after 3 days she returned to the upper floor and did not speak again. She painted, only painted, not with brushes, but with her hands, and the paint was not paint, and the canvas was not canvas, and the figures she made were not human, not animal, not God. And the house began to change around her. Doors vanished, rooms flipped upside down, clocks bled, rats spoke in children's voices, and then the family began to die, one by one, with no wounds, no signs of violence, just silence. Eyes open, skin cold, as if something had stopped their hearts from the inside, something that knew their names, something that had been waiting to be betrayed. They tried to burn the paintings. They tried to burn her, but the fire would not take. And the last patriarch wrote in his final letter, "It is awake now, and it remembers." And this letter, too, was removed from the public record. And now no one speaks of the girl who painted in the dark, whose eyes never blinked, who walked without sound. And yet the townsfolk still cross themselves when they pass the north woods. And the children still dare each other to throw rocks at the estate gate, and the crows still do not land on the roof, and the windows still reflect something that is, not the sky. So when you ask why the estate was never demolished, why the land was never cleared, why no investor touched it, no priest blessed it, no historian documented its halls, the answer is simple and final and irreversible, because it is not empty. It was never empty. It does not rot. It waits. It listens. It wants. And if you stand too long near its threshold, you will begin to feel it too. Not a chill, not a fear, but a remembering, something inside you waking up, something that has always been part of you, as if your blood knows the pact, as if your name was already written in that dark red ink. And the moment you believe you are safe is the moment you hear her voice in your head, not speaking, not screaming, just humming that same note over and over, the one that ends all silence and begins all madness. And that is why the Ashford estate remains, not as a ruin, not as a monument, but as a wound, an opening in the skin of the world. And every so often something leaks through, They always said the Ashford family was untouchable, not because of the wealth they flaunted or the land they consumed, like fire through brushwood, but because something about them bent the rules of consequence itself, as if the laws that governed men did not apply within the stone walls of their ancestral estate. And by the time anyone realized it, it was far too late, because by then they had already stood at the edge of the orchard behind the house, where no apple tree had ever borne fruit, no flower had ever bloomed, and no sound ever escaped, and where the soil despite every season remained dark as ink, as if stained by centuries of something deeper than decay, because the truth was that no one who ever lived in that house lived clean, and nothing ever buried that was entirely dead. You can walk the estate, now you can stand beneath the ruined stone arch that once held the wrought iron gate, and you can even kneel at the cracked marble statue of the Virgin at the rear chapel, if you have the stomach for lies. But what you will not find is the basement, and what you will not feel is the way the air shivered when the last Ashford drew breath in that place, because long before the name died above ground it had already gone to seed far beneath, and what remained down there was not death, but something worse, something preserved, something that was never meant to expire. And when they first started to suspect, the family had more than bones beneath their crypt, when whispers of the silent nurse began circulating in hushed tones during Mass, the villagers already knew they had stayed silent too long. She was never named in the registry, never listed in any of the staff records, yet she appeared in almost every portrait painted between 1790 and 1834, always in the periphery, always in the corner where oil darkens like dried blood. A woman in a starched white bonnet, with a face too calm and eyes too black to belong to anyone still in the light. And when they finally removed the canvas from its frame in 1911, they found that her hands were not painted, they were stitched into the surface with human hair. Someone had sewn them into the work, not as art, not as embellishment, but as warning, or maybe as ritual. And behind the canvas, tucked between rotting wood and mildew, was a note written in Latin, smeared in a brownish ink. That tested positive for hemoglobin, and it said only this: Ipsa videt quod nos non videmus. She sees what we do not. Her presence had been felt long before her name was ever breathed in fear. They say children born within the estate gates cried, until they bled from the mouth, that servants refused to clean certain rooms without singing, and that every second son of the Ashford line either vanished or took his own life before the age of 23, and none of it was coincidence, none of it was folklore, because inside the third door of the servants' corridor, beneath the main hall, there was a passage sealed with iron nails and marked with a crescent made of animal teeth, and those who pried it, open in 1924, found a stairwell that spiraled downward in unnatural symmetry, as if it had been carved by machines, long before machines existed, and at the bottom was a room no larger than a child's bedroom, entirely mirrored on all sides, with not a single light source, and yet everything inside glowed faintly blue, including the cradle that sat in the center. They don't talk about what they found inside that cradle, or if they do, they lie, because every man who entered that room died within 6 months of an identical aneurysm, and the notes from their autopsies were burned by court order. But one nurse spoke to her sister before her own collapse, and she said it wasn't a body in the cradle. It was a shape, a small human-shaped impression in an otherwise empty velvet cushion, but that when you stood close enough, you could hear breathing, slow, shallow, rhythmic, and not quite mammalian, like something mimicking the act of life. And when she leaned in to listen, she heard her own name whispered from inside the cushion in a voice she hadn't heard since her childhood, a voice belonging to her father, who had died 17 years earlier, and she ran and never returned, and she died in her sleep 41 days later with her teeth clenched so tight they had to break her jaw to perform the autopsy. They called it a hallucination, called it grief poisoning, called it trauma echoing through the bloodline of people too inbred to process reality, but every Ashford diary found in the sealed wing. Of the house mentioned the cradle, and every Ashford woman who gave birth on the property bled for 9 days, no more no less, and if she lived the child would go silent for 1 hour on its 9th night, as if something was holding its breath through their mouth, and once the hour passed, the child would scream as though it had been dropped from great height, and only then would the family accept it as their own. The town priest Father Renwick once wrote in his private journal that the Ashfords practiced something older than Christianity, something rooted in pre-Roman soil, that they believed blood memory could be infused, not just passed down, and that through certain acts of intimacy, violence, and sacrifice they could create a vessel not bound by one soul, but inhabited by many, and that these vessels walked among us wearing flesh that was not entirely theirs, and that the family line was not a lineage, but a lucre ritual constantly recycling the same entity through different bodies, and that the estate was not a whole, it was a machine built to sustain this cycle, feeding on the grief of nearby villages, siphoning belief through carefully crafted tragedy, and ensuring that those born into the line were never truly new, just returned, just recycled. And that was why no Ashford ever truly changed, no matter how far they traveled, how much they studied, how good they pretended to be. In 1953, a team of amateur historians tried to document the truth. They spent 2 nights inside the estate. They never spoke again publicly, and 2 of them committed suicide by the same method within 60 days of each. Other one by swallowing a pair of antique crib shoes, the other by jumping from the top of a mirror factory. Cower backwards, holding a christening gown soaked in animal blood, and their 3rd member, who survived, went blind on the 3rd night and could only scream the word reflections until they sedated him, and even now he sits catatonic in a private facility, his palms burned with what looks like bite marks, though no animal was ever found in his room. And yet the Ashford family crest still hangs in the ruined ballroom, a lion devouring its own tail above the motto, non est mors sed transitus. This is not death but passage, and those who study the crest closely say that the lion has human eyes, and the tail is not a tail but a chain, and the teeth are uneven as if filed by human hands, and that once you've seen it, once you begin to dream of it, even if you don't believe in curses, even if you've never set foot near the estate, and once the dreams begin, they do not stop, they only grow more vivid, more instructional, and those who obey them end up missing, and those who resist wake up with blood in their sheets and images carved into their skin that match symbols found beneath the cradle room, the same symbols etched into the bones of Ashford infants buried under false names in the churchyard across town. This is not family history, this is not madness, this is inheritance engineered 1,000 years before the first birth recorded, and it is still active, because blood rituals do not end with silence and power taken, does not dissipate, only waits, and what you call folklore. What you laugh off as dramatic embellishment is a system of control older than your language, a prison built of stories designed to keep your eyes closed. And if you think you are safe because your name is not Ashford, then you have learned nothing. Because the cradle does not ask for lineage, it only asks for permission. And every night you dream of something breathing behind your walls, it is asking again, and you are closer now than ever before. So tell me now, do you still believe this was just a tale, just another chapter in a decaying family record? Or can you feel it too pull the gravity of the blood, trying to remember its true name? Because if you can, then you have already stepped through the gate, and it is far too late to turn back. You think you have heard the worst of it by now. You believe that the madness ends in the bones under the staircase, or the whispers in the nursery, or the diary pages soaked in something that was not ink. But there is something deeper, older, something none of the historians dared to document, because it did not fit into timelines or family trees or estate records. Because what breathes beneath the foundation of the Ashford legacy is not something that died with the last heir or was buried in scandal. It is something still alive, something still hungry, and something that once seen cannot be unseen, once heard cannot be unheard. Because the final truth of the Ashford family was never about cruelty or madness or rituals or even power. It was about what they protected, what they fed, what they obeyed. It begins not with Jonathan Ashford, or even the old manor, but with a stone that does not erode. A symbol that does not fade, etched deep into the earth beneath the foundation before the bricks were laid. A black spiral coiled into itself, like a living thing carved into the bedrock of that hilltop, long before any white man set foot on that land, long before the village was founded, long before the Ashford name existed, and the settlers who first tried to build near it vanished, their houses found with furniture intact, but no bodies, their tools rusting where they were dropped, and when the Ashfords acquired that land, they did so quietly, paying far less than its worth, because the locals believed it was cursed, because animals would not breed there, and crops would not grow, and people who lived too close spoke of voices beneath the ground that did not stop even when you covered your ears, voices that used your name. That spiral, that black stone, it appears again and again in the Ashford estate, in the basement tiles, in the ironwork of the third-floor railing, in the seal on Jonathan Ashford's signet ring, even in the ash left behind after the Great Fire in 1894 that supposedly destroyed half the estate, but left the spiral untouched, fused into the floor, red-hot and breathing like an open wound. And when experts came to inspect the ruins, 3 of them refused to speak ever again. 1 went blind without explanation, and the last walked into the forest and was never seen again. Only his notebook recovered near the creek, with a single phrase repeated on every page. It is not dead, it is not dead, it is not dead. You see, the Ashfords did not worship in the traditional sense. They were not merely practitioners of some decadent cult or remnants of some forgotten European order. What they did in the name of their family, their bloodline, their survival, was far more intimate, far more frightening, because the thing they served was not a god or a demon or a symbol of power. It was something that needed them, something that relied on them to stay tethered to this world. And in return, it gave them prosperity, influence, madness, and decay, and it needed only one thing in return: descendants. That was the true purpose of the Ashford bloodline. Not inheritance, not legacy, not fortune, but containment, a chain of flesh and name and ritual to bind whatever pulsed beneath that spiral, whatever grew hungrier with each passing generation. And it is no coincidence that the Ashfords who broke the line, who fled the estate, who refused to marry within the family, or refused the rights, died young or mad or vanished entirely. It is no coincidence that every birth was followed by a sacrifice, and every death by a sleepless night in the basement, where the walls seemed to breathe and time seemed to stretch, and the smell of iron and salt made the air too heavy to cry in. By the final generation, the family had fractured, splintered into rumors and secrets and shame, but still they returned to the estate, drawn back by dreams they could not remember and guilt they could not name, and the final child born under. The Ashford name was not recorded in any official ledger, not buried in any marked grave, not mentioned in any diary, because that child was not meant to survive, not meant to breathe beyond the hour of his birth, because his mother heard the thing speak to her during labor, not in words, but in pressure, in pain, in the twisting of her bones, and she tried to smother the child with her own hands before the midwife intervened. But it was too late. The spiral had already accepted him. Some say the boy was raised in the East Wing, kept hidden from the world, educated by letters that arrived with no return address, and food delivered by gloved hands through a sliding panel. And some say the boy was not a boy at all, but something that wore his shape, something that spoke only in mimicry, only repeating what it heard. And when it laughed, the birds fell silent for miles around. And when it cried, the paint peeled from the walls and the windows cracked inward. The last known document from the Ashford estate is a torn page from a priest's journal dated 1923, found wedged behind the altar of a nearby chapel that was abandoned shortly after. It reads, "They brought him to me and asked for baptism. But when I touched his forehead, the water turned to blood, and I heard my mother's voice, though she's been dead 5 years. I do not think he is meant to be saved. I do not think I am either." Then nothing, no records, no sightings, no wills, no funerals. Only the estate, sealed by the Historical Society, condemned by the county, left to rot under ivy and dust, and whatever shadows still moved behind the cracked windows. Until last year, when a group of urban explorers entered through the wine cellar, armed with flashlights and live streaming gear in arrogant disbelief, laughing at the rumors, mocking the silence, but within 23 minutes the live stream cut out, the last frame showing the spiral glowing faintly beneath their feet, and the last sound a wet, shuddering breath that did not belong to any of them. 2 were found wandering days later, unable to speak, their hands stained black as if with ink or blood or something older, and the others have never been recovered. But the footage remains, stored on a private server, accessed only by investigators and historians who think they are ready, who think they can explain, who think the Ashford story is just a cautionary tale about old money and generational guilt. But the truth is simpler and darker. The Ashford estate was not haunted, it was not cursed, it was a gate, and the family was the lock. And now the line is broken, and something is loose, and if you're hearing this, you were never meant to, because some knowledge does not liberate, it infects, and the spiral is still turning.